Howdy again everyone. Now, my late father was a great influence on me and did lots of cool things, but he also had a bit of a habit of collecting old junk, and among his things, I recently received this old M42 mount budget lens from the 1960s, the Pentax Asahi Super Takumar 55mm f2. Goodness knows where he or even my grandfather got it from, but one thing I do know is that it has a relatively good reputation for a legacy lens, and some people also claim that it's radioactive. Well, unfortunately, a Geiger counter isn't a regular piece of equipment I have lying around my office for testing camera lenses, so I couldn't really say. I kept it well away from my groin while I tested it though, just in case. It was produced in the early 60s from about 1962, and it's available on the old M42 camera mount, for which you can find all kinds of adapters for mirrorless or digital SLR cameras nowadays. Its average price on eBay is about £40 or around $50, although you'll have to pay more if you want one in excellent condition. This, I believe, is the first version of the lens. There were a few different versions of it manufactured, with slight variances in aesthetic and mechanical design, although as far as I know, the optics of the various different versions were always the same, except for the coatings. This one definitely does not have lens coatings, and versions which do, later versions, are normally designated SMC. Whatever the design and image quality is though, there is no denying that a 55mm f2 lens is still really useful nowadays for all kinds of general photography and subject and shallow depth of field photography, so it could end up being a bit of a bargain for someone on a low budget, although manually focusing such a lens will be tricky for some people. This is the kind of lens that was used by the masses back in the 60s, being nice and accessible to most people, opening up the world of 35mm photography to everyday working Joes like you and me. The lens itself is a completely typical design for its era. It is of course completely manually controlled, manual focus, manual aperture, and no image stabilization. It's mostly made of metal, feeling nice and solid, but it's also nice and light, weighing just over 200 grams, under half a pound. At the rear is an aperture control ring. There are 6 iris blades to the aperture mechanism, and above that is a metallic manual focus ring which turns very smoothly with a nice long throw of about 210 degrees for precise focusing. Here you can see that the lens displays some pretty clear focus breathing, zooming in and out as you refocus. My copy of this lens had a little slip-on metallic hood, and it accepts 49mm filters, although it was a very tight fit when I mounted a polarizing filter on there. There's no bayonet fitting for a lens hood. Overall, this is a completely bog-standard build quality for a legacy lens of this kind. If you are new to using this kind of classic lens, what will impress you is the wonderful smoothness of its aperture ring and the solidness of its metallic build quality, and what will also hit you is the grimly functional nature of its mechanical design. Let's take a look at its image quality now. I'm going to utterly punish this lens by mounting it onto a camera far more challenging than it was ever intended for, a Canon EOS R5 with its 45MP full-frame sensor. There are, of course, no in-camera corrections available for this lens. At f2, in the middle of the image, sharpness is just about acceptable and contrast is weak. Interestingly though, the corner image quality isn't that much worse. I was expecting a much more serious deterioration here. Also impressive is the lack of visible colour fringing. Let's top down to f2.8. That corner image quality is brighter and a little sharper, and back in the middle we see more sharpness, and contrast has also improved. At f4, the lens is very sharp in the middle with very good contrast, and the corners, well, they're lagging a little behind now. However, at f5.6 the corners finally look pretty sharp, and at f8 and f11 we see some minuscule further improvements. Overall, by today's standards, this lens is a little soft wide open with somewhat low contrast. However, 60 years ago, film shooters would have been pretty impressed by its performance, especially considering that the corner image quality remains acceptably sharp at f2 with low chromatic aberration. No wonder this lens has a fairly good reputation for its age. With some added contrast and sharpening when shooting at f2, your images with this lens will actually be fairly good. Alright, let's look at distortion and vignetting. This lens projects some moderate barrel distortion, and at f2, the image corners are pretty dark, as you'd expect on such a small sized lens. At f2.8, those corners are still a bit dark, but at f4, they brighten up considerably. So, when shooting at f2, you might want to make some light corrections when editing your pictures. The lens's minimum focus distance is 45 cm. That is completely average for a standard lens of this kind and not really especially close. At f2, the close-up image quality is definitely a little softer than at normal distances. At f2.8, we see a clear improvement, and at f4, the close-up image quality is sharp, although contrast remains on the low side at all apertures. Let's see how this lens works against bright lights. As I mentioned, this is not the SMC version of the lens, and so it predates lens coatings, but I don't really need to tell you that, as you can see its performance for yourself. This older version is a complete flaring and glaring disaster zone whenever bright lights so much as come near your image. And now, Bokeh. Low-budget 50mm lenses are hardly renowned for the quality of their out-of-focus backgrounds, and this 60-year-old design fares relatively poorly, giving bokeh that's quite nervous and edgy with colourful highlights around bright points of light. However, deeply out-of-focus backgrounds can sometimes look nice and smooth. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. As you can see, it is pretty strong here at f2 and f2.8, and even at f4 some traces remain. It's only really at f5.6 that those unwanted colours go away. Overall, for a lens of this age, the Super Takumar 55mm f2 delivers a completely average performance except for one area, sharpness and chromatic aberration in your image corners, where, for a lens from the early 60s, it is sharper than you'd normally expect to see with lower colour fringing. As I said already, add some contrast and sharpening to your images, and even at f2, you will get some nice, striking pictures. As for me, I'd rather just spend a bit more money on a nice, modern, autofocus 50mm f1.8 lens, but if legacy is your thing, then the Super Takumar is likely to warm the cockles of your photographic heart, and it deserves its reputation for being one of the better legacy lenses out there.